So, welcome to this edition of Seen Solved, presented by Hubbard-Hall. I'm Tim Pennington, editor-in-chief at finishingandcoating.com. And today, again, we're graced with the presence of Connor Callais, an application specialist at Hubbard-Hall, who's going to be talking. Our topic is going to be today, what is it, Connor? Is it phosphates and pre-treatments?
Yeah, so we kind of have this general umbrella of conversion coatings, and within that, it's not so much a bifurcation between pre-treatment or phosphating, but there are all sorts of different surface modifications that you can do. So you can implement them for pre-treatment, for pre-paint, or you can do those modifications for other mechanical properties as well.
I'm Tim Pennington, and you're listening to Seen Solved, brought to you by Hubbard-Hall. Better results, less chemistry. Before we begin, I have a very important question. Tell me a fun fact about yourself. I know I've known you for a couple of years, actually spoke with you at a couple of conferences, but tell me something very interesting that people would not know about you, Connor.
So probably about 6-7 years ago now, I spent a semester in France studying wine and winemaking, and of course wine tasting. And I was able to take my level 1 sommelier exam.
Really? You spent how long there?
I think I was there for 5 months.
Right. Really? That sounds like you were just lost and traveling around.
Yeah, it was supposed to be educational credits.
Educational credits. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Money well spent, by golly. So let's really a level 1, and is that the top level?
No.
You got a long way to go.
I could never get the top levels.
Well, you're trying, I could assume, right?
Yeah, I mean, every weekend I'll taste a couple more.
You're right. Okay. So, and what's your most recent favorite?
I've actually been drinking a lot of Walla Walla Syrah.
Okay. From where?
Walla Walla Valley in Washington State.
Ah, okay. There you go. Okay. I was thinking the convenience store. Was it Wawa? Something like that. So, okay. You confused me there for a bit. So I was thinking, the hell do you got to be a level 1 if you're going to go to Wawa? But anyway, interesting. Well, we'll pick that up. That'll be another topic of another day. So, well, let's get back to our phosphates and our pre-treatments. What's the difference? What's between those two? I've heard them used many different times, the same and different. Clarify for us what those mean.
So when we talk about conversion coatings, traditionally we're speaking of phosphates. Phosphates are obviously a phosphoric acid-based solution that you apply typically to a steel surface. And what it does is it takes that smooth steel, reacts, and creates some sort of phosphate crystal structure on the surface. This increases basically the surface area available on a particular, let's say you had a square inch of steel, and then you were to put this phosphate coating over it. Well, that surface area then becomes 2, 3, 4x the amount of available surface area as it creates different valleys and ridges through the crystal structures that are placed or that are formed on the surface of the part. So this pre-treatment allows you to either get better paint adhesion or some surface rust protection, or also some other mechanical properties such as like anti-galling or lubricity. And it's kind of like a softer coating that ends up being put on the surface of the part. And so it really does serve as both a surface modification and surface protector once it's applied.
Right. Some people talk about pre-treatment as just cleaning, right? Getting the surface ready, cleaning, but you're actually causing the formation of the surface to change just a bit, correct? Is that
correct? So we're taking it's just like another coating almost, but we're basically putting a layer of microscopic crystals on the surface of the steel when we do this. So we're actually converting the top surface, the top surface of any part, panel, steel, and we're creating basically a new layer on top of that. Right. With the pre-treatment modifications.
Gotcha. You know, because it's funny, you mentioned the words conversion coatings, and I think that's, again, people use those sort of interchangeable sometimes, right? Phosphating, conversion coatings, pre-treatments. So I guess, depending upon what you're trying to do a little bit, those words are sort of synonymous a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, and within this larger umbrella, there's a lot of different types that you have. So more traditionally, so the process kind of was, I guess, discovered or invented back actually in the early 1900s. It used to be called parkerizing. And it was done as a way to prevent parts from essentially just rusting. A lot of gun gun parts that would easily rust, they were able to do this, apply this onto there, and basically give it a much better anti-corrosion. The guns didn't jam as much because you had that anti-slip on there. And then over the years, they started figuring, hey, this is actually a good precursor or a primer almost to any sort of paint, because instead of having this smooth surface, you end up getting a really rough surface, kind of like sandpaper almost, where you have this higher grit on the surface that gives the paint more to hold on to.
Right. Right. So break it down for us. Why is this so important, such an important step in the surface finishing process? And I guess to answer that, I guess what benefits is it bringing to a finisher and the process?
Sure. So kind of touching on a couple things we said earlier. So if depending on what your end use and your application will kind of guide you into the purpose of what this coating's for. A lot of times this is often used in a spray system where you'll be going through a series of steps prior to going to a paint booth. So let's say we were doing it for a pre-paint system. You'd want to make sure you have like an effectively clean surface. Occasionally you'll need to do some sort of descaling or activation of the surface if there's a lot of scale on the surface of the part as well. Then you'll go into the active phosphate chemistry, which is basically sprayed or immersed on. And once that solution comes in contact with the steel, it starts to form the different crystal structures. So you can have co-metals in there that kind of change which way or what type of crystal you're going to be forming, such as you can do a zinc phosphate, you can do a manganese phosphate, or you can even do an iron phosphate, which really just kind of takes the iron out of the bare metal itself to create the phosphate crystals that go on the surface. And then from there, you'd either go through a sealant stage or some sort of basically flash rust inhibitor, because this chemistry typically is on the acidic side. So you want to make sure that if you didn't get 100 complete coating or complete conversion of the surface, you want to be able to make sure that you're preventing any flash rust that occurs after leaving that particular area on its way to the paint booth, because flash rusting can be an issue as well.
Right. Are you finding most people are getting that right? I mean, when you're going in and seeing what they're doing, because it seems like there's a lot of variables, right? Substrates and those type of things. Are they getting it right for the most part of what they should be using?
For the most part, yes. I'd say, it kind of depends shop to shop. Some processes are very analytical and they want to make sure that everything's done to the highest degree. Those tend to be less problematic. And some people have been doing this or a variation of this process for decades. And as long as it's good enough, you're going to paint over it. They don't quite care all the time. So it kind of depends on the actual process. I mean, I think with any application, there's always some room for improvement to kind of get you back to the standard that you want to be at, to make sure that you have consistency across the board every time. So that, I don't know if that kind of answers that or not, but
well, it does, because I guess the end result would be whether they're getting rejects, good adhesion, those type of things. They're going to know quickly if they're not doing it right.
Absolutely. And then on the other side, since this is a larger umbrella, sometimes you're not going to a paint booth, but you need this surface coating on a part because it needs to be not susceptible to corrosion in the field. So if you're doing sometimes or oftentimes with a zinc or a manganese coating, you need to make sure that you're getting a certain either coating weight or coating distribution to ensure that you have no voids basically on the surface of the part. And those voids tend to be where you're going to have corrosion or rusting sort of stemming from. So one way we kind of quantify that was we'll do what we call coating weight analysis. So you basically take a part with a known surface area that you've already treated, get an analytical weight for that, thoroughly dry it before you do that. So that you're weighing just the bare component or steel in addition to the coating that's been applied to it. Then you use either chromic acid or a concentrated hydroxide, and you can strip that coating off, thoroughly clean and dry it again and reweigh it. And then that net difference of the weight divided by the surface area of the part that you've been analyzing you can derive a coating weight. And that's a very important metric for a lot of applications.
Right, right. There are many different types of and classes of pre-treatments, right? People talk about, and I guess based on the variables. So let's talk about those different types and classes of the pre-treatments. Take us through those.
So traditionally, when people think of phosphates, I would say that they pretty much are going to be thinking of zinc or manganese phosphate. Zinc phosphate probably is more prevalent. It's a little bit easier to use, a little easier to control. And within each of these categories as well, there's different types of divisions within those as well. So within traditional zinc oxide, or excuse me, zinc phosphate, you have kind of a general product, which does just a standard typical zinc phosphate coating. Then you can also take from there, do a calcium modified version, which will give you basically a lower, more refined crystal structure on the surface. And then there's also, on the other side, you can use a really heavy zinc phosphate coating, which tends to be a little bit more raw, not quite as refined compared to the others. But if you need a really heavy coating weight, you can use one of those as well. If you really need a heavy coating weight, though, people tend to defer to using a manganese co-metal, because the manganese phosphate does get you a really good crystal structure that has some bulk to it. This is great for a lot of engine components where there's going to be metal on metal, because the crystal structures that they end up putting on the part are kind of soft compared to the metal. So they give you some lubricity between them. They prevent galling from occurring. And they're also good at, when you do these surface modifications, you obviously, like I said, create a lot of valleys and ridges on the microscopic level. And those can really hold on to corrosion inhibitor as well. Since we have a lot of cavities, these oil-based products can kind of seep into there and kind of bond, almost, not really bond, but they really kind of form a good adhesion to the surface that you're working with. So you can really create a fairly corrosion resistant component using those coatings.
Right. I was going to say, take me back a second. You mentioned galling. Define what that is and how that occurs. And
So galling is basically anytime you have two metal components and they kind of have a shear against one another.
mm-hmm.
And sometimes that shear can kind of, the friction between them can kind of build up and you get stress on the parts, and it can lead to deformation basically of the metal at higher pressures. So anti-galling, which these coaters provide, kind of provides some slip to them, to where instead of kind of locking up or seizing or distorting the metal, they'll more easily pass by one another, basically have a lower coefficient of friction.
Right. And a lot of this we're talking about maybe, internal combustion engines for automotive, those type of things, some aerospace and things like that, where you got metal and metal a lot.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Great. Let's take me through the actual steps of applying this sort of conversion coating. What's it start? What are all the steps that are involved in that?
Sure. So with any component, you want to make sure that you have a really clean surface. So cleaning is always a critical aspect of any pre-treatment that you're going to be doing. Depending on if this process is going to be spray or immersion, will kind of derive what sort of cleaner we want to use. Obviously, if you're doing a spray application, you don't want to have a high foaming cleaner, because then all that's going to be carried down and just create more issues. And when we're looking at the cleaner, we also want to analyze what sort of contaminants are going to be on the surface prior to. So if we're dealing with, let's say, tubes that were drawn, they may have some really tenacious lubricants like stearates that need to be removed chemically prior to going through with the rest of the active coating. Once you go through your cleaning process, you're going to make sure you have a thorough rinse and make sure that you get that surface as clean as possible. Oftentimes at this point, you start to have a really active surface, especially if you're using a really high pH or caustic cleaner. Occasionally, between your cleaning step and your actual phosphating step, you'll need to have what we call either a conditioner or an activator, or sometimes there's a pre-dip that you need to use prior to. This can be done for a number of reasons. For iron phosphate in particular, sometimes we want to make sure that we have the surface free from any scale. because occasionally that can cause problems, especially on the iron phosphates and the zirconiums, the components where you're not going to be building a really heavy coating weight. You want to make sure that you minimize any surface scale on there. So we'd use either a conditioner, or for some of the products like the manganese phosphate, you'll want to pre-seed the surface with activation sites. So we'd use basically a what we call a grain refiner. It seeds the surface with activation sites so the crystals can grow more densely together rather than just kind of grossly wherever it naturally would grow. And we go through the actual active phosphating step for most of these processes. They can be done with immersion or spray, and typically takes anywhere from a few minutes up to 20 minutes or so for that chemistry to react, depending on, of course, like we were saying, what type of phosphate coating you're going to be applying. From there, you'd go through a series of rinses also to make sure that you have all the chemistry that is left over fully removed, and then you'd be going into a sealant or some sort of corrosion inhibitor as your last step.
Right. Right. It's funny, you mentioned these steps, and I know, Hubbard-Hall Harpson, using less chemistries. And do you find that some facilities that have problems, maybe they've got steps that they don't need in there, or they're, maybe not doing it in the proper order, or using or not following the proper protocols that are being used with that?
Sure. I honestly, in terms of using less chemistry, what we see the most is just not proper maintenance or adequate care of the baths that they have. And that causes them to have to dump them way more frequently than they normally would. Particularly with some of the more, I don't want to say problematic, but the more dynamic products like a manganese phosphate. You have several different factors, and they can kind of get wonky or go out of operating parameters if you're not controlling them and taking care of them, or using them frequently enough. And sometimes they get beyond the point of resurrection, and people just determine it's easier just to dump it and start over, rather than if they took time and made sure on a regular basis that they're maintaining these chemistry levels, making sure that they stay within range. That way they could be able to save this chemistry and use it for a lot longer. We have some people that are using a manganese bath for 6 to 12 months at a time before they have to decant and recharge. Another issue we see a lot, particularly with immersion lines, is kind of have this balance between wanting to run this process efficiently enough to where you are maintaining a consistent process, and also not allowing any corrosion or rust to occur while you're in between steps, so during your transfer time. But sometimes speeding that up too much, you'll really lose a lot of your chemistry due to drag out. So whenever you're designing a process, you really want to kind of look at all the factors involved. What type of parts you're going to be running? How are you going to be racking them or processing them in a barrel? If you're running parts that have like concavities or cups to them, you want to make sure that you're doing those in a barrel process efficiently enough to where that excess chemistry can drain out back into your tank, rather than being carried out and lost into a rinse or something. So there's a lot of different areas that you want to look at to make sure that we're conserving the chemistry that we're using it efficiently and effectively.
Right. Yeah, like I said, and that's money down the drain. Let's just put it that way. I mean, if they're not using it, if they're dumping baths way before they should be, it is lost money. So a good audit, that's another topic, another day. But definitely, making sure that, like you said, it's being used properly, and that they're not having to dump this so much. But I know we've talked in a couple previous episodes about rust prevention. And so how does this coating process actually, protect metal surfaces from corrosion, and keep the rust away?
Sure. Kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. So there's a number of different corrosion inhibitors that can be used in conjunction with a pre-treatment process. A lot of times in processes where we're going to be going to a paint, in a later step, we're going to use a water-based corrosion inhibitor, often referred to sometimes just a water-based sealant. These use of either salts or amines to basically neutralize any active surface sites on the coating and any voids in the bare metal to prevent corrosion from accelerating as it would naturally. those are often used, like I said, and they can be applied anywhere from ambient sprayed on to heated, so they can flash off a lot quicker, depending on how immediate you need this dry part to go into a paint booth.
Mhm.
With some of the more traditional zinc and manganese phosphates, we tend to use a heavier corrosion inhibitor because a lot of times these parts aren't necessarily going to paint afterwards, but they're going to be going into the field as is. So we'll use either water soluble oil or a water displacing oil because those are able to kind of, I had touched on earlier, they can kind of seep into the pores and the crevices created with these coatings and provide some really good long-term protection. Anytime you're applying one of these oil-based products, you'll also want to make sure that they're dried off effectively. That can be either done through a blasted air chamber or a spin dry, because you don't want to have excess product on there. That's another, going back to chemical conservation. If you can spin that off or maintain as much of that as possible and retain that, you can minimize your chemical use that way as well.
Right. Right. We spoke about painting, and let's talk about pre-painting. So how does this pre-treatment help a subsequent painting coating operation?
Mm-hmm. So with oftentimes with painting, what we're trying to do is create basically a surface modification that's going to give you good paint adhesion and rust protection. A lot of people don't realize, but your surface of the metal can rust underneath the paint as well. So when we do these pre-paint treatments, we are trying to address both of those concerns at the same time. A common test that's done to evaluate how well the paint adheres to the surface is a paint adhesion test using a salt spray chamber, whereby you'll take a representative panel, you'll give it your pre-treatment and paint it accordingly, just as you would a part that you're going to put out into the field. And you would basically score it down the panel and place it in the salt spray chamber. And we're looking to get oftentimes several hundred, if not into thousands of hours of corrosion protection and paint adhesion. So basically, once you have done or finished the exposure time in the salt spray chamber, you'll take the panel out, and then you'll take a metal scraper and you basically go back and forth along that score that you previously created. And you try to see, where is this paint flaking off of the part? Anywhere it's flaking off, you're not having the best adhesion. And then we kind of basically take a average of those distances, or the creep is what we call it, from that score mark. And that averaged value will kind of give us a metric as to how effective that adhesion was in that pre-treatment process.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, then how do you solve that then? It tells you a problem, right? Tells you how effective it is. So what kind of steps do you do then to solve that issue?
Sure. So with a lot of the pre-paints, we're using primarily going to be an iron phosphate. It's where we tend to use, sometimes some people use zinc, some people use zirconium, but traditionally we're going to use an iron phosphate in those sort of applications. And you would do a coating weight analysis to kind of see, all right, how heavy is this iron phosphate coating that we're putting on the surface prior to paint? How dense is it? How heavy is it? And if we need to get more protection, sometimes we'll increase that amount, or sometimes we'll look at doing a specialized sealant after the fact to increase the paint adhesion from there.
Gotcha. Yeah. You've given a lot of information about this, more than I probably even knew. But so, in a summation, in a kind of in the solved category, how is the quality of a coating qualified? I mean, how do you know if it's working well, and also how do you quantify it? I mean, how do you know after all this is said and done?
So that really kind of comes down to the industry or the application, and how specific, what you're specifically looking from your pre-treatment, what sort of properties you're looking for. If you're going into a pre-paint, like we said earlier, we're going to want to basically analyze indirectly the adhesion of the paint with the surface of the part. So we'll do the paint adhesion in salt spray. We'll also do just a bare corrosion study with the paint on there to see how long it takes for these parts to begin to rust. Another test that is commonly done is a crosshatch test, where you basically do several score marks in an X pattern on the part, and you can basically put a piece of tape down and rip it off, and you see, all right, how well did the paint stay on this part after creating those spores and trying to remove it. It's another indirect way that we'll do that. The coating weight is another quantifiable metric that's used in all sorts of phosphate coatings, because that really gives you an indication of where's the distribution and what is the size of the crystals that you're putting onto this part over a specified area. That can tell you a lot about the coatings that you're providing, and then also notify you ahead of time if something's not going right in this process. Because a lot of times visually you can tell some things visually, but you're not going to be able to quantify how dense or how heavy your coating is just by looking at it. You can tell, oh, it's not working at all visually, but you're not going to be able to say, oh, we're a little lighter than we need to be, or we need to be a little heavier, what way or the other.
Gotcha. Wonderful. That's great information. I appreciate you, because it's often like I said, people, it's not a sort of glamorous step in the process, but it's so essential for it all to work. And like I said, to reduce rejects and to get it right. So
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Connor. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Hubbard-Hall Seen and Solved. It sounds like you've solved a lot of those problems, which is great. Anyway, viewers can visit Hubbard-Hall.com to watch other episodes that we talked about. I know we referenced some of the ones we talked about on rust prevention, some other things. But anyway, thank you for joining us, Connor, today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Seen and Solved is brought to you by Hubbard-Hall. Better results, less chemistry. For more podcasts, go to Hubbard-Hall.com or wherever you get your podcasts.